The promotion announcement lasted less than 4 minutes, but I remember every second of it because Daniel Cross smiled at me before reading someone else's name off the screen. Mine had been on the internal staffing forecast for almost 3 months. Everyone in strategy knew it. I'd handled the Archer acquisition, rebuilt 2 collapsing vendor contracts, and spent 14 straight weekends preparing the expansion numbers the board was reviewing that Friday. But at 9:14 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday in Chicago, the senior director role went to Evan Mercer, the CEO's golf partner with 6 months at the company and a reputation for forwarding my presentations with his name attached. Nobody looked surprised except me, which somehow hurt worse. HR told me afterward that leadership wanted someone with a calmer executive presence, even though I'd spent the previous year quietly fixing problems created by the same executives nodding around that conference table. I didn't argue. I just thanked them, walked back to my office, and opened the email attachment someone had anonymously sent 3 minutes earlier. The subject line only said, "Board members haven't seen the December expenses yet." And after I opened the spreadsheet, I finally understood why Evan looked nervous during the applause. I was 28 years old, the youngest operations strategist ever assigned directly to Halbrecht Global's executive planning division. And for 2 years I'd built a reputation for being the person who cleaned up disasters without needing credit for it afterward. That was probably why they assumed I'd stay quiet. People like Daniel Cross preferred women who made impossible situations look effortless but never asked to sit at the head of the table once the crisis passed. Evan fit their world better anyway: expensive watches, private club memberships, loud confidence during meetings where other people had already done the work for him. By Wednesday morning, the entire office had already shifted around him like the promotion had been inevitable all along. Assistants started copying him on executive emails. Managers suddenly laughed too hard at his jokes. Someone even cleared my reserved seat in the quarterly board prep meeting without asking me first. What nobody realized was that I still had access to the operational audit folders because legal had requested my documentation during the Archer acquisition review 3 weeks earlier. At 7:42 p.m. that night, while the executive floor emptied and the cleaning crew rolled carts past the glass offices, I opened the December expense archive again and noticed 3 charges tied to a client retreat that had never actually happened. The first thing I noticed about the December expenses wasn't the amount of money missing. It was how carefully the numbers had been rounded, almost like someone expected nobody to look past the summaries presented during board reviews. Halbrecht Global moved too much money too quickly for executives to question a few luxury hotel charges or executive entertainment reimbursements buried inside a quarterly packet. Most board members only wanted confirmation that profits were climbing and investors stayed calm. Details belonged to people like me. By 8:16 p.m., I had 3 spreadsheets open across my monitors, a legal notepad filled with handwritten dates, and a growing headache behind my eyes as the same names kept appearing beside suspicious approvals: Evan Mercer, Daniel Cross, and CFO Richard Vane. The expense category listed a client retention summit in Scottsdale, Arizona, from December 11th through December 14th. According to the reports, 12 senior clients attended private strategy sessions at the Mirador Grand Resort. The company reimbursed nearly $148,000 in travel, entertainment, and hospitality expenses connected to the trip. The problem was simple. I'd personally coordinated the Real Client Retention Summit that month, and it happened virtually because severe winter storms canceled most executive travel across the Midwest. There had never been a Scottsdale retreat. At 8:31 p.m., I checked the archived Outlook calendars. Evan and Daniel had blocked the dates as executive planning meetings. Richard Vane marked himself unavailable for investor travel. None of that proved fraud yet, but my stomach tightened when I opened the attached receipts. For presidential suites. A champagne service billed at 1:12 a.m. Spa reservations under corporate billing codes. A jewelry purchase quietly categorized as client gifts. Someone had tried very hard to disguise personal spending as executive retention costs. I should have reported it immediately. Instead, I printed everything. Years working around executives taught me one important survival rule: never confront powerful people before understanding how protected they are. So I stayed quiet Thursday morning while Evan walked into the office wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He stopped beside my desk with the easy confidence of someone who thought the room already belonged to him. "No hard feelings about Tuesday, right?" he asked casually, adjusting the silver cufflinks peeking beneath his sleeve. Leadership just needed someone more aligned with the board. I looked up from my monitor slowly enough to make him uncomfortable. "Aligned with what exactly?" I asked. He smiled like I'd confirmed something for him. "Optics matter at this level." Then he walked away before I could answer. Around me, keyboards kept clicking, phones kept ringing, and nobody acknowledged what had just happened because corporate humiliation only feels uncomfortable when people believe they might be next. At 11:05 a.m., HR scheduled a career trajectory discussion with me for Friday afternoon. The timing felt surgical. Promote Evan publicly, isolate me privately, then encourage me to leave gracefully before anyone questioned the decision. By lunchtime, I already suspected they planned to restructure my department under Evan within the month. But at 2:17 p.m., something happened that shifted everything. I received a Microsoft Teams message from Melissa Grant in corporate accounting. We weren't close friends, but we'd survived enough executive meetings together to recognize exhaustion in each other's faces. Her message only contained 7 words: "Do not discuss the Scottsdale charges internally." My hands froze above the keyboard. I stared at the screen while another message appeared beneath it almost immediately. "Legal requested backup copies this morning." Before I could respond, her status turned offline. 20 minutes later, her employee profile disappeared from the internal directory entirely. Not suspended. Removed. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just executive overspending anymore. Someone inside the company was already trying to contain the damage before Friday's board meeting. And for the first time all week, I stopped feeling humiliated about losing the promotion. I started feeling dangerous. By Thursday evening, the executive floor felt different in ways most employees probably wouldn't have noticed. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Assistants who normally smiled at me suddenly looked nervous, holding eye contact longer than necessary. Even the security staff near the elevators seemed unusually alert, like someone upstairs had quietly warned them tension was building before Friday's board review. I stayed calm anyway. Panic makes people sloppy, and sloppy people rarely survive corporate investigations. At 6:48 p.m., while most departments prepared to leave for the night, I sat alone inside conference room 14B reviewing archived procurement approvals connected to the fake Scottsdale retreat. That was when another inconsistency surfaced. The payment authorizations weren't routed through standard finance channels. Richard Vane had bypassed internal approval thresholds using discretionary executive authority tied to a dormant acquisition account from the Archer merger. It was sophisticated enough to avoid routine audits but reckless enough to collapse under serious scrutiny. More importantly, it meant multiple executives knowingly participated. I printed the authorization trail and slipped the pages into my leather portfolio seconds before my office phone rang. The caller ID displayed Daniel Cross. I let it ring twice before answering. "You're still here?" he asked casually, though his voice carried the tight control of someone already irritated. "Finishing transition work," I replied. A brief silence followed. "You've always been valuable to this company, Natalie," he said carefully. "I'd hate to see disappointment affect your judgment." There it was. Not an accusation. A warning disguised as mentorship. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "I'm not disappointed," I answered. "Just paying closer attention lately." Another pause. Then his tone hardened slightly. "Friday's board meeting is important. I expect complete professionalism from everyone in attendance." The call ended without goodbye. I sat motionless afterward, staring at the dark glass walls around me while downtown Chicago reflected back in fractured lights across the windows. Daniel knew someone was looking into the expenses. He just didn't know how much I'd already uncovered. At 8:03 p.m., my phone vibrated with an unknown number. I almost ignored it until a text appeared underneath, Garage Level 3. 10 minutes. Come alone. Rationally, I should have contacted legal immediately. Instead, I grabbed my coat and headed downstairs because curiosity can overpower caution when you know powerful people are hiding something ugly. The underground parking garage smelled like concrete dust and engine oil, nearly empty except for a black Lexus idling near the far corner. Melissa Grant stepped out wearing the same gray coat she'd worn during last quarter's audit meetings. Up close, she looked terrified. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Immediately, scanning the garage behind me. "Then why ask me here?" I replied. She opened her purse with shaking hands and handed me a small flash drive. "The Scottsdale expenses are only part of it," she said quietly. "Richard's been moving executive spending through dormant acquisition accounts for almost 11 months. Daniel approved everything." My chest tightened. "How much money?" Melissa swallowed hard before answering. "Enough that if the board finds out before they control the narrative, people go to prison." For several seconds, the only sound between us was the low hum of fluorescent garage lights overhead. "Why give this to me?" I finally asked. Her eyes met mine with exhausted honesty. "Because they're preparing to blame accounting if this leaks publicly. And because you're the only person upstairs they still underestimate." Then headlights appeared at the garage entrance. Melissa's expression changed instantly. "I have to go." She climbed back into the Lexus without another word and disappeared up the exit ramp before I could stop her. I sat inside my car afterward gripping the flash drive so tightly my fingers hurt. Part of me wanted to drive home, lock the evidence away, and pretend none of this involved me anymore. But another part remembered Evan standing beside my desk talking about optics while executives quietly stole money behind closed doors. At 11:26 p.m., I opened the files on the flash drive from my apartment kitchen table. By midnight, I understood why Melissa looked so frightened. The documents didn't just expose fraudulent expenses. They exposed board members receiving manipulated financial summaries designed to inflate acquisition performance before an upcoming shareholder vote. And buried near the bottom of one spreadsheet was a scheduled agenda item for Friday morning's board meeting labeled simply, "Finalize Executive Restructuring." My position appeared directly underneath it. I barely slept Thursday night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw numbers shifting across spreadsheets and Daniel Cross standing at the front of the conference room pretending leadership decisions were based on merit instead of loyalty. By 5:40 a.m. Friday morning, I was already dressed and sitting at my kitchen counter rereading the files Melissa had given me while cold coffee sat untouched beside my laptop. The deeper I went into the records, the clearer the strategy became. Daniel and Richard had been artificially inflating acquisition profitability ahead of a major shareholder confidence review scheduled for the next quarter. The fake Scottsdale retreat was only one visible crack in a much larger system. Executive entertainment, private travel, personal purchases, even undisclosed consulting payments had all been rerouted through dormant acquisition budgets designed to disappear inside merger-related accounting noise. Evan Mercer wasn't the architect. He was the reward. Promote the CEO's loyal golf partner into senior leadership before restructuring departments, then quietly remove anyone experienced enough to notice inconsistencies afterward. At 7:12 a.m., I received the official calendar invite for the board meeting. My attendance status had been changed from presenter to observer. Another deliberate humiliation. They wanted me visible enough to signal compliance but powerless enough to stay silent. I arrived at headquarters just after 8. Rain hammered against the lobby windows while executives moved through security carrying leather portfolios and carefully rehearsed confidence. Evan spotted me near the elevators and offered the same polished smile he'd been using all week. "Big day," he said lightly. "You holding up okay?" I pressed the elevator button without looking at him. "Better than some people will be by lunchtime." His smile faded slightly, but before he could answer, the elevator doors opened. By 8:47 a.m., the boardroom had filled with 12 directors, 2 outside legal advisors, Daniel Cross, Richard Vane, and half the senior executive team. I took my assigned observer seat near the back wall beside corporate counsel while Evan sat proudly near the center of the long walnut table like he already belonged there permanently. The presentation began exactly how I expected: optimistic forecasts, aggressive expansion language, carefully polished financial summaries projected across massive screens while directors nodded through prepared talking points. Daniel controlled the room smoothly. He always did. Men like him built careers on making manipulation sound like leadership. At 9:26 a.m., Richard Vane began presenting acquisition performance metrics tied to the Archer merger. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. Calm matters when people expect emotional reactions from you. Then halfway through slide 18, something shifted. One of the outside board directors, Eleanor Whitmore, former federal prosecutor and easily the most feared person in the room, interrupted Richard mid-sentence. "I have a question regarding discretionary acquisition expenditures from December," she said evenly. Silence landed instantly across the table. Richard's expression barely changed, but I saw his fingers tighten around the presentation remote. "Specifically," he asked carefully. Eleanor removed a pair of reading glasses from her folder. "A client retention summit in Scottsdale billed at approximately $148,000. Daniel answered before Richard could speak. "Those expenses were reviewed internally," he said smoothly. "The event supported." Eleanor cut him off without raising her voice. "Interesting," she replied. "Because according to the independent documentation delivered anonymously to the board last night, the event never occurred." My eyes moved slowly toward Evan. Color drained from his face almost immediately. Around the room, directors exchanged confused looks while one of the outside attorneys began flipping rapidly through printed materials that clearly hadn't been included in the executive presentation packets. Richard attempted a measured smile. "I believe there may be incomplete context regarding those reports." Eleanor slid a folder across the table. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain the jewelry purchases categorized as client retention expenses first." Nobody spoke. The room felt airless suddenly, thick with the kind of silence that appears seconds before public collapse. Then Daniel did something that surprised me. He turned toward me. Not angrily. Carefully. Calculating. "Natalie," he said calmly, loud enough for the room to hear, "since you previously assisted with Archer operational oversight, were you aware these materials had been distributed externally?" Every face in the boardroom shifted toward me at once. There it was. The setup. Blame the overlooked woman before the executives lost control of the narrative. But before I could answer, the boardroom doors opened behind me, and 3 people walked inside accompanied by corporate legal. One of them carried federal credentials clipped openly against a dark navy blazer. And suddenly, nobody at the table looked interested in protecting Evan Mercer anymore. The moment the federal investigators entered the boardroom, the entire balance of power changed so fast it almost felt physical. Conversations stopped mid-breath. Richard Vane lowered his eyes to the table. Evan's hand froze around his water glass. Daniel Cross remained composed longer than the others, but even he couldn't completely hide the tension tightening along his jaw as corporate legal quietly closed the doors behind the investigators. The woman leading them introduced herself as Special Agent Claire Moreno from the Department of Justice Financial Crimes Division. Calm voice. Controlled posture. The kind of presence that made executives suddenly remember every email they'd ever sent. "This meeting will pause temporarily," she said evenly. "Nobody is being detained at this time. However, We are requesting immediate access to financial records connected to the Archer acquisition accounts and all executive discretionary spending approvals from the previous fiscal year. Nobody moved. Outside, rain streaked against the glass skyline while 40 floors above Chicago, the most powerful people in the company sat perfectly still trying to calculate how much damage had already escaped containment. Daniel recovered first. "We intend to cooperate fully," he said smoothly, standing with executive confidence that probably intimidated most rooms. It didn't intimidate Agent Moreno. "Good," she replied. "Because portions of your accounting records were already provided to federal investigators 3 weeks ago by an internal whistleblower." That sentence landed like a controlled explosion. Richard looked physically ill. Evan stared directly at Daniel now instead of me, and for the first time all week, I realized he genuinely hadn't understood how serious the situation was. He'd thought this was politics. Promotions. Favoritism. Executive maneuvering. He never realized he'd been standing inside a federal investigation the entire time. Eleanor Whitmore slowly removed her glasses and leaned back in her chair. "Daniel," she said quietly, "is there any reason this board was not informed that outside investigators were already reviewing acquisition expenditures?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no answer came immediately. That silence mattered more than anything he could have said. Executives survive on certainty. The second certainty disappears publicly, authority collapses with it. At 9:41 a.m., corporate legal requested a private recess with the board. Executives were instructed not to leave the floor. Security personnel quietly appeared near the elevators minutes later. Nobody needed explanations anymore. The story had already written itself across everyone's faces. I stayed seated near the back wall while the room emptied into fractured whispers and controlled panic. Evan approached me first. Gone was the polished confidence. Gone were the rehearsed executive smiles. Up close, he looked pale and suddenly much younger. "Did you know about this?" he asked quietly. I closed my folder carefully before answering. I knew enough to stop trusting people who confuse loyalty with competence. His expression tightened. "You could have warned me." I met his eyes evenly. "You accepted a promotion built on removing the person actually doing the work. What exactly did you think was happening upstairs?" He didn't answer because there wasn't one. A few minutes later, Daniel crossed the room toward me with the same measured composure he'd worn all week, except now I could see exhaustion underneath it. "You've handled yourself very strategically," he said carefully. "But situations like this become dangerous for everyone involved." I almost smiled at that. Even now, he still thought intimidation sounded persuasive. "The dangerous part," I replied calmly, "was assuming nobody below you was paying attention." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then corporate counsel called Daniel into a private conference room where federal investigators already waited. He adjusted his suit jacket before walking away, but the confidence was gone now. What remained looked like a man finally realizing control and immunity were never the same thing. By noon, emergency board notices suspended both Daniel Cross and Richard Vane pending investigation. Evan's promotion announcement disappeared from internal systems before lunch. At 2:06 p.m., Eleanor Whitmore personally asked me to remain through the executive transition review process. Her exact words stayed with me long after the meeting ended. "This company spent years rewarding visibility over competence," she said. "That mistake appears expensive." The strangest part was how calm I felt walking out of the building that evening. No victory speech. No dramatic confrontation. Just quiet clarity. A week earlier, they'd looked at me and seen someone easy to overlook. By Friday night, the same people wouldn't even meet my eyes in the elevator. 3 months later, Halbrecht Global announced a full executive restructuring after federal investigators expanded their financial review into multiple acquisition accounts tied to former leadership. Daniel Cross resigned before formal termination proceedings finished. Richard Vane accepted a negotiated settlement that permanently barred him from serving as a public company officer again. Evan Mercer lasted exactly 11 business days under interim oversight before quietly submitting his resignation through legal instead of HR. Nobody applauded when he left. By then, most employees already understood the difference between confidence and competence. I never chased the senior director title again after that because the board created something larger instead, a new operational oversight division reporting directly to independent directors instead of executive leadership. Eleanor Whitmore asked me to lead it personally. The same executives who once called me too intense suddenly wanted my approval before signing anything involving acquisitions or discretionary spending. Funny how professionalism becomes valuable once accountability enters the room. Sometimes people mistake silence for weakness simply because they can't imagine someone observing them carefully instead of reacting emotionally. But power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a woman sitting quietly at the back of the boardroom while everyone else underestimates her until the doors finally open. If you've ever stayed calm while people underestimated you, subscribe. Because some reversals are worth waiting for.